Picture this: you're walking through the marble corridors of a 17th-century estate in central Hungary. The castle is cold. Not from weather, it's late summer, and the trees outside are full and green, but from something else. The stillness. The quiet. Servants move with precise, almost mechanical speed. No one speaks above a whisper. The walls are clean, but not decorated. No food is being prepared. No fires are lit in the kitchens. And most disturbingly, no one is eating. You round a corner and see one of the maids, young, barefoot, skin sallow, lips cracked. She moves quickly out of your line of sight when she sees you. You follow the hall to a locked storeroom. On the other side of the door, a girl is sobbing. You listen for a moment before the footsteps approach. Everyone scatters. Because she is coming. Countess Erzsébet Báthory. If this is your first time hearing the story of the noblewoman accused of starving her own attendants in the name of youth and appearance, hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. These aren't legends. They're taken from sworn testimony, court records, and over 300 witness statements. This is not the tale of blood-soaked bathtubs and vampiric myth. This is something colder, quieter, and real. Countess Báthory was born in 1560, into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her relatives included high-ranking church officials, judges, and warlords. She was married at 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a military officer known for his brutal campaigns against the Ottomans. But while he was away at war, the management of the estates, including the dozens of servants and tenant families who worked them, fell to Erzsébet. Over the years, rumors grew. Not of murder. Not yet. But of hunger. Peasant girls taken in to work the kitchens and bedrooms were never seen again. Those who did return, often years later, were frail, silent, and aged far beyond their years. They spoke of long days of labor with no food breaks. Of fainting in corridors. Of being punished for asking for bread. Court testimonies collected in the early 1610s included dozens of accounts that said the same thing. Meals were withheld deliberately, even during times of plenty. Workers were expected to continue, even as they grew dizzy and weak. Some collapsed and were beaten for it. Others were locked in storage rooms without food for days at a time. The Countess, it was said, watched calmly as they begged. The official household accounts show that food purchases dropped sharply in the late 1590s. The kitchens ordered fewer grains, less meat, fewer vegetables, even though the number of servants on the estate had increased. Noble guests were still fed, of course. But staff were given scraps, if anything. The idea, multiple witnesses claimed, was that suffering kept them obedient. And thin. Erzsébet Báthory, even in her 40s, was obsessed with appearance. Not just her own, but the appearance of her household. A thin, quiet servant was a good servant. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, downcast eyes, these were signs of beauty, discipline, and control. She didn't just tolerate suffering. She arranged it. In a 1611 statement, a stable hand described how the Countess personally inspected the appearance of each maid. If a girl appeared too full in the face or too confident in posture, she was punished. In some cases, starved for up to a week on nothing but water. Another witness, a kitchen worker named Ilona Joe, said that girls who ate without permission were forced to stand naked in the snow for hours. This wasn't punishment for crime. It was a regimen. And it had a purpose. The Countess, according to several of her closest attendants, believed that beauty and youth were reflections of inner purity, and inner purity could only be achieved through discipline. Hunger, she said, tightened the soul to the skin. While many remember Erzsébet for the blood myth, allegations that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, those claims only appeared later, after her arrest. But the starvation. That part was consistent across all witness accounts. Girls went in healthy. They came out broken. By 1604, when her husband died, Erzsébet took full control of the Nadasdy estates. And the conditions worsened. Peasant families were promised jobs for their daughters, maids, kitchen assistants, sewing help. But months later, when no word came, some traveled to the estate to find their daughters either gone or too weak to speak. One father, a tenant farmer, testified that he had seen his daughter only once after delivering her for service. She had lost over half her weight and could barely stand. He was ordered off the property immediately. Inside the manor, no one dared speak. Two surviving letters from mid-level stewards suggest that even staff feared being reduced to fasting discipline. A phrase Erzsébet herself reportedly used when instructing her servants. She told me, one letter reads, that a girl who is not obedient is too full of herself. She must be emptied. There are no official photographs or portraits of the Countess in old age, but multiple foreign envoys and noble guests described her as unnaturally smooth-skinned, lithe, and composed. One even remarked that she looked younger at 50 than she had at 30. Whether or not it was true, it added fuel to a dangerous belief that her cruel methods were working. When she traveled between estates, the same patterns followed. Servants reported being denied food for days at a time, then being called in for inspection. Some were slapped for appearing bloated. Others were mocked. One witness claimed the Countess said, "A servant with a full belly is uglier than a toad." The starvation was not random. It was structured. Each estate had a steward or maid-in-chief who kept track of feeding schedules. Girls were rotated between light and heavy labor to prevent outright collapse, but no one was permitted to eat without express approval. In many cases, the girls were ordered to serve feasts to noble guests without having eaten in 2 or 3 days themselves. Some died. When questions were raised, the deaths were blamed on illness or pre-existing weakness. And because these were peasant girls with no political power, no one investigated. At least not yet. One account from 1608 tells of a girl who collapsed while cleaning a stairwell. She was revived with water, but when Erzsébet arrived and saw her puffy face, she ordered that the girl be taken below and not fed again. The girl died 3 days later. Her body, according to a servant, was quietly buried in the woods. The practice continued for years. Not only in her main estate, but in secondary castles throughout Upper Hungary. It wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. Erzsébet seemed genuinely to believe she was improving them, making them more obedient, more attractive, and more useful. In 1610, the Hungarian crown finally ordered an investigation. Not because of rumors of blood or vampirism, but because of mounting reports of disappearances and abuses. Over 300 witnesses were interviewed, and most of them said the same thing: the Countess starved her girls. For beauty, for control, for power. The investigation began quietly. In 1610, Count Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary and one of the most powerful men in the region, was ordered by King Matthias II to look into the rumors surrounding Countess Báthory. The official concern was not murder, nor blood rituals; those allegations would come later. The real issue was the number of dead girls being reported by local clergy and landowners. Too many funerals. Too many unmarked graves. Too many illnesses affecting only young, healthy servants. Thurzo approached the case like a military campaign. He gathered sworn testimony, visited the surrounding villages, and spoke to parish priests. The pattern became clear almost immediately. Nearly every village near the Báthory estates had missing girls. Families claimed their daughters had been hired as maids or seamstresses and then vanished. What emerged from these testimonies wasn't a story of secret torture chambers or supernatural rites. It was something worse, a system. A household operation designed around withholding food, manipulating appearance, and punishing disobedience not with pain, but with deprivation. Some of the earliest testimonies were from former servants, those who had escaped or been dismissed. They described what they called the Order of Fasting, a term reportedly used by Erzsébet herself. In it, new girls were tested not on their skill or cleanliness, but on their ability to endure hunger without complaint. Failure meant reassignment to training, which meant starvation. Multiple witnesses claimed that the Countess personally inspected meal logs, crossing off names of those she felt had grown soft. If she believed a girl looked bloated or slow, her food was cut in half. If the girl protested, it was cut completely. One former cook testified under oath. "We prepared less food than was needed. The meat was for the lady and her court. The rest, thin soup, boiled weeds, was rationed. If the girls fell during work, we were told not to help. If they asked for more, we said nothing. Because we were afraid." That fear was well-founded. 2 cooks disappeared during the early 1600s. Their families were told they had stolen from the kitchens and fled. But the other staff believed they had simply displeased the Countess and been reassigned to the labor corps, where starvation was common. Another witness, a woman named Susanna who had served in the laundry, said, "She told us a bloated stomach meant bad character. She liked the ones who trembled and kept their eyes down. If we looked well-fed, she thought we were stealing. And she would punish the girls by cutting their food, then cutting it again, until they couldn't stand." This was not a palace of torture. It was a palace of discipline and silence. The investigation by Count Thurzo picked up speed. By late 1610, dozens of bodies had been located on the grounds of Countess Castle and other Báthory estates. Most were buried without ceremony. Some showed signs of injury, but many were simply emaciated, reduced to skeletal frames. Some had clearly died of exposure, others of starvation. These weren't war prisoners or criminals. They were household staff, peasant girls, hired and discarded. And yet, even with mounting evidence, there was hesitation to act. Erzsébet Báthory was still a member of one of Hungary's most powerful families. Her relatives included members of the royal court, high-ranking clergy, and military officers. Accusing her publicly risked civil disruption. So Thurzo proceeded carefully. He gathered written depositions. He interviewed minor nobles and former employees. He sent letters to the king, outlining the evidence. And then, finally, in December 1610, he moved. Thurzo arrived at Countess Castle with armed men and a sealed warrant. The countess was in residence. What they found inside has been disputed, but the core facts are clear. 3 servants were found dead. Another 2 were near death, emaciated, dehydrated, barely conscious. 1 girl was found chained in a storage room. She had not eaten in days. The scene wasn't ritualistic. There were no occult symbols or blood-filled basins. It was, instead, the aftermath of neglect. A household running on starvation as its central method of discipline. Witnesses described logbooks where feeding schedules were recorded in precise handwriting, entries with red slashes through certain names. Those names matched the dead. The countess was not arrested immediately. She was too high-ranking. Instead, she was placed under house arrest, confined to her castle. But her staff were taken into custody, and they talked. One by one, the inner circle of household servants began to reveal the scale of the abuse. Not just the starvation, but the rationale behind it. They said Erzsébet believed hunger refined a woman's body. That thinness was proof of obedience. That suffering made the skin clearer and the face smoother. One longtime maid testified. "She told us beauty is made through want. That to want food and not take it made a girl more graceful. She called it the discipline of restraint." Other staff members described how food was used not just as punishment, but as reward. Girls who pleased the countess were allowed small portions of meat or bread. Girls who failed her, by speaking out of turn, tripping, or looking swollen, were given nothing. It was, as one steward put it, a system of moral correction through starvation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were widespread, repeated, and normalized. A former guard said he once saw a girl crawl out of the scullery in search of food. She hadn't eaten in 4 days. When Erzsébet found her, she had the girl tied and left in the courtyard overnight. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The girl died before sunrise. Another worker said he was told never to deliver more than a half bowl of broth to any kitchen maid. If a girl asked for more, he was to report her. Punishment followed every report. The testimonies piled up. And yet the charges remained vague. The Hungarian court still hesitated to accuse a countess of murder outright. Instead, they focused on abuse, improper burial, and the use of starvation as a form of internal discipline. The phrase deliberate deprivation appeared in several documents. So did aesthetic purpose. It was understood she was starving girls not only to control them, but to perfect them. Thurzo's final report to the Crown included over 80 witness accounts. Of those, at least 30 mentioned starvation specifically. One girl claimed she had not eaten a full meal in over 2 weeks before she escaped. Another said she had learned to drink melted snow to survive. The girls weren't just starving. They were being transformed into objects, silenced, withered, shaped to reflect the Countess's vision of beauty and submission. And it worked. Because no one fought back. No one dared. After the arrest of Erzsébet's household staff, the Hungarian authorities were left with a problem: what to do with a noblewoman too powerful to be publicly tried, but too dangerous to ignore. In January 1611, a closed-door legal proceeding began. It wasn't a trial in the modern sense. Erzsébet Báthory was never brought before a judge. Instead, her four closest servants, Dorottya Szentes, Ilona Joe, János Udvari, and Katerina Banica, stood accused. They were interrogated, tortured, and eventually confessed. Their statements included references to death by starvation, deliberate food deprivation, and forced fasting as punishment. Dorottya, the former maid-in-chief, admitted to managing the feeding rotations. She described how the Countess would inspect the girls herself and adjust their rations based on appearance alone. If they looked plump, she would say they had too much joy. And joy was forbidden. Ilona, a kitchen overseer, described how new girls were tested by being denied food for 3 days. If they begged, they were punished. If they endured silently, they were promoted to better duties. János, a male servant, said he once saw a girl collapse during chores. Erzsébet told him to let her die, saying her weakness reveals her vanity. These testimonies painted a consistent picture: starvation wasn't incidental. It was intentional. A tool for reshaping the bodies and behavior of those under her control. What made these accounts so powerful was their consistency. Each witness, questioned separately, told the same story of a noblewoman obsessed with obedience, purity, and aesthetic control. And the hunger was central to that control. One key piece of evidence presented was the castle ledger, a handwritten book containing lists of servants, assignments, and feeding schedules. In the margins were notes such as, "Too bold, half ration. Cheeks swelling, water only. Must be corrected, no bread." The ledger was real. It was reviewed by court scribes and included in the official record. Still, Erzsébet herself was never brought to testify. Hungarian law forbade the execution of nobles without overwhelming proof and a formal trial approved by the crown. But the evidence, over 300 witness statements, several dead bodies, physical injuries, and signed confessions, was more than enough to sentence the servants. On January 7, 1611, 3 of them were executed. One had her fingers torn out before being burned. Another was beheaded. The fourth, Katerina, was spared death due to her age and given life imprisonment. As for the Countess, she was confined to her castle under permanent house arrest. According to letters from Thurzo, the windows of her chamber were bricked up, leaving only a small slot through which food could be passed. She was forbidden to see anyone except a few approved guards. Her estates were placed under administrative control by her relatives. No trial, no confession, just silence. But the silence spoke volumes. Over the next 3 years, Erzsébet lived in isolation. She was now over 50. No visitors, no ceremonies, no feasts. But the reports from the guards monitoring her remained unnerving. One wrote, "She still inspects the bread, breaks it with her fingers, sets it aside, eats little, says the belly is the enemy of grace." Another recorded that she had asked to see a mirror but was denied. There were no letters from Erzsébet herself during this period. Only third-party references. What remains are the observations of guards, the letters of Count Thurzo, and the continued testimonies of former servants who trickled into courts and parishes with their own memories of the hunger. Some of them couldn't speak of it without trembling. One girl, interviewed in 1612, said she still woke up at night hearing the Countess's voice saying, "Fat is laziness made flesh." In total, estimates of the number of victims vary. Some documents suggest as few as 36 confirmed deaths. Others, inflated by later myth, claim over 600. But the Hungarian court settled on a lower estimate, around 80, based on graves and testimonies. The cause of death, in many cases, was listed not as torture, but as decline, weakness, or failure to recover. All euphemisms for starvation. And yet, what disturbed officials most wasn't just the scale. It was the intent. Erzsébet hadn't killed in rage or defense. She hadn't lashed out in desperation. Her actions were measured, deliberate. She observed, judged, and adjusted. She viewed hunger not as cruelty, but as correction. Beauty through denial. Order through control. In 1614, 3 years after her confinement began, she stopped eating entirely. According to a guard's final note, she lay in her bed and turned away the bread. She whispered, "I am full of time." And then she slept, and would not wake. On August 21, 1614, Countess Erzsébet Báthory was declared dead. Her body was buried quickly, without ceremony. Her grave, originally located in the village church of Cactus, was later removed, either by angry locals or her own family, fearing desecration. Its location is unknown, but the memory of her remained. Not the bloodbaths, not the fantastical stories of vampirism that would later surround her name, but the real legacy, the documented, repeated starvation of girls under her command. In 1765, a Hungarian historian reviewing court archives described her as a woman who killed not with blades, but with hunger. Another called her the quiet predator. And in the oral histories of the villages near Cactus, older generations spoke less of demons and more of cold hands, empty bowls, and the sound of footsteps at night, girls walking barefoot, searching for food they were not allowed to have. In the centuries after her death, Erzsébet Báthory's name did not vanish. It changed. By the late 1700s, folklore had overtaken fact. Pamphlets circulated throughout Hungary and Austria, telling wild stories of blood drinking, necromancy, and satanic rituals. In these tales, she bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young forever. The starvation, the structure, the court documents, all faded behind the myth. But the historical record remains. And when you strip away the legends, what's left is more unsettling. This wasn't a vampire. This was a noblewoman with total authority who used hunger not just as a punishment, but as a tool of refinement. She didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as superior. Over 300 testimonies were taken during the investigation. A significant portion of them didn't speak of blood at all. They spoke of thinness, of rations, of beauty measured by suffering. In 1768, archivist Laszlo Tarocci published one of the earliest printed accounts of the Báthory case. His work reintroduced the world to the Countess and reawakened interest in her crimes. But by then, the narrative had already started to warp. Writers began to amplify the most sensational aspects. Newspapers referred to her as the Blood Countess, a term that would stick for centuries. Few bothered to re-examine the actual court records. Fewer still noted that most of the recorded deaths occurred not through physical torture, but through extended denial of food and water. And yet, those records are clear. Erzsébet operated within the framework of a noble estate. She didn't use knives or poisons as her main instruments. She used scheduling, inspection, and silence. Her ideology was one of austerity. She believed that beauty required pain, that obedience required deprivation, and that to show weakness, by begging for bread, by fainting, by gaining weight, was to fail one's role entirely. Even more disturbing, many of her beliefs echoed those held by contemporary physicians and philosophers of her time. Across 16th and 17th century Europe, ideas about beauty were deeply tied to morality. A thin, pale woman was considered pure. A full-bodied one was viewed as indulgent, corrupt, or unclean. Erzsébet didn't invent this mindset. She simply enforced it to its most brutal extreme. In the late 19th century, as Europe industrialized and historical revisionism gained popularity, some Hungarian writers tried to defend her. They claimed the charges had been exaggerated to steal her land. Others argued she was a victim of political jealousy. And while it's true that her family's vast holdings made her a target, the sheer volume and consistency of the testimonies make a total fabrication unlikely. The modern consensus among historians is this: the bloodbaths were legend. The starvation was fact. She ran her estate like a system of aesthetic purification. Girls were hired, assessed, and controlled. Their food intake was rationed according to the Countess's judgment. If they failed to meet her standards, they were withheld. And in many cases, they died. Not in public, not in ritual, but quietly. In beds, in storerooms, on stone floors near the kitchens. One after another. In 2008, the Slovak National Museum mounted a retrospective on the Báthory case, featuring original documents from the trial. Among the artifacts was a handwritten letter from a priest who had been stationed near the estate. It read, "The Countess has no need for swords. She carves the soul by letting the body starve. It is not rage I see in her eyes, but calculation. For scholars of gender and power, the case remains important. Erzsébet Báthory was a noblewoman in a time when women were rarely given direct authority over land and staff. But her status afforded her protection. And with that protection came unchecked power. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply removed food. And in doing so, reshaped the very idea of service, beauty, and obedience into something mechanical. Something hollow. Today, her legacy is mostly consumed by horror films, novels, and Gothic fantasy. But behind the fiction is a truth far more disturbing, that a woman with education, wealth, and status could build a system where hunger was the principal form of control, and where no one dared resist. No rebellion. No uprising. Only decline. Her story raises questions that linger far beyond 17th century Hungary. How far can aesthetic ideology go when backed by absolute authority? How easily can cruelty be disguised as discipline? And what happens when beauty becomes a weapon? In the end, Erzsébet Báthory didn't need to drink blood. She drained life in a different way. By turning nourishment into privilege. By redefining starvation as virtue. By building a house where silence was survival, thinness was loyalty, and death was just another correction. Her victims are not known by name. Their graves are unmarked. But their stories, buried in court transcripts and parish records, still speak. And they tell us this. In a cold castle in Upper Hungary, a noblewoman once reshaped young women in her image, not with spells or blades, but with an empty bowl. And no one stopped her. If this is the first time you've heard the real story of Erzsébet Báthory, not the vampire, but the noblewoman who starved her servants for beauty, hit like, subscribe, and comment below. These stories aren't legend. They are history. And they happened.